Welcome to Impactful Chats. I'm Malin Martinez,
And I'm Seth Trueger.
and today we're chatting again with Apoorva Mandavilli, Science and Global Health Reporter for the New York Times and the 2019 winner of the Victor Kahn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. Welcome back, Apoorva.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. So first, I guess most importantly, I just want to thank you for the excellent reporting you've been doing during the COVID-19 pandemic. You've really been a critical contributor to the efforts to combat and expose misinformation and disseminate factual information, which is also our objective with Impact. So kudos and our gratitude to you for that.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. And your most recent articles in the New York Times have both kind of addressed COVID testing, though kind of from very different angles. First, you dropped a kind of bombshell last week about the HHS almost kind of commandeering the CDC webpage on COVID testing. Can you start just by reminding anyone or telling anyone who maybe didn't see it about what you discovered through your investigations for that article?
Yeah, so what that article showed is basically that, as you mentioned, the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the CDC, had basically dictated what was in this one guidance document that said that people who have been around somebody who's infected but aren't showing symptoms don't need to get tested. And when that guidance came out in late August, it created a real controversy, and people thought, this makes absolutely no sense. Why would we not want to have every single contact of someone who's infected get tested? People blamed the CDC, people mocked the CDC, and really thought that the CDC got it very, very wrong. People who know the CDC well thought, well, this sounds a little strange. It sounds like there might have been some political meddling, but there really wasn't any proof. And what happened last week is basically that a few people that I speak to on a regular basis within the CDC finally were willing to go, not quite on the record, but tell me on background that this document was in fact doctored by the HHS, that it did not come from the CDC, and that it didn't really represent what CDC scientists think should happen.
Right. And were any of your sources able to tell you about the typical process that a CDC statement typically undergoes prior to release?
Yeah, so I mean, every CDC document, CDC gets a lot of blame for being slow, and especially during this pandemic. And there's a good reason for that, it turns out, most of the time. And that is that every single document that comes out of the CDC goes through a lot of people. There's one particular person or a department that will own the document, but then, they write it, but then they circulate it to every department that is relevant to the content of that document. And all of those scientists get to make comments and get to push back or clarify or correct. And the person or department who owns that document takes all of those comments on board. So it's kind of a slow, meticulous process, almost painful, as some people put it, but it serves a very good purpose, which is that it makes sure that what is in the document is absolutely represents the best of the latest science and really tells people what they need to do in a very clear and accurate way. What happened this time is that the document arrived at the CDC, and possibly even somebody at the CDC wrote some version of it. And then it was circulated to scientists. They saw something like 8 versions at least of this document. They made a lot of comments, said, this doesn't make sense, this isn't correct, this can't be the case. And they were told by somebody pretty high up who reports to the director that they will not actually have the chance to make any substantial edits, that they're not allowed to make any substantial edits. They didn't hear anything more about it, and they didn't know what happened to it. And then the next thing they knew, it showed up on the website and it was being labeled a CDC document.
Okay, and so I can see how maybe the HHS and CDC could potentially work together on certain projects or documents. Does the HHS typically work together with the CDC on things like this, or did you learn that at all?
Right. It's not quite working together. It's more like the CDC might prepare a document, and depending on the document's importance, it may go to the HHS. It may even go all the way to the White House on occasion for sort of a sign off. But in typical administrations, what happens is that the higher ups might see the document, but they defer to the expertise of the CDC scientists. This kind of event where the HHS then completely rewrites and revises the document until it's unrecognizable to the CDC scientists, or in which they completely just reject all of the comments and concerns of the CDC scientists. That is unprecedented. I spoke to a couple of former CDC directors who, were just shocked by this. And one of them said something like, this happening is like somebody writing graffiti on a national monument. I mean, it's just, they were outraged at the idea that political appointees would take upon themselves to describe CDC science when the scientists themselves are not being allowed to comment.
Yeah, exactly. It's really sort of sad and frustrating for those of us in medicine and in science. It almost sounds like, did you get the sense that this document and the actual web page were just sort of commandeered by the HHS, or was the CDC kind of going along with them and just kind of doing what they were saying?
It's unclear who in the CDC and how high up knew that this was going to happen. The level of scientists that I speak to, who are my sources, were not aware. And if it's possible that the director knew, Director Robert Redfield, it's possible that maybe one or two of his deputies knew. But I think beyond that, most people did not know. When I say, that they took it over, it doesn't mean that they posted it to the website themselves. I think they sent a document over, and then the CDC, whoever works on the website, did actually post it, but it still came as a surprise to most of the CDC scientists who would normally be aware of a document of, this importance.
Yeah, and I think your article also mentioned that this doesn't seem like the first time something like this has happened during the pandemic. Is that right?
Right, and as my colleagues reported, a few days before my article came out, it also came out that political appointees were meddling with the MMWR, which is a weekly CDC report that summarizes important studies. And I've also heard from my sources that they haven't been allowed to talk about their own work. Their science, their research might come out in an MMWR, and they were forbidden to talk to the media. They were forbidden to even explain or put their findings into context. So they had to sit back and watch while other people described their work, maybe even got it wrong, and they could say nothing.
Wow, that's really hard to hear. Um, and then, still on the subject of testing, you wrote another article recently reporting on COVID tests that return a positive result that perhaps should not be considered positive. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I want to be very careful with how I say this, because this particular article has been misinterpreted a huge amount. The point of this piece was basically that there is this value when you run a PCR, the PCR test that detects virus, it has to run a certain number of cycles. And the more cycles it has to run to detect the virus means that the less virus there was to begin with. And that it's called a CT value. So the higher the CT value, the less the person's viral load or the amount of virus in their body. And what I discovered during my reporting, partly, from information I gathered from Dr. Michael Minna at Harvard, is that a lot of the PCR machines in various public health labs are set at a CT cutoff that is really high. So typically, the CDC's own science, in fact, shows that anything above a CT value of 33, you probably don't have live virus. It's really hard to culture live virus. So beyond, anything higher than CT, you're probably looking at, fragments of dead virus or somebody who was infected a long time ago, but really does not have any live virus that's capable of multiplying anymore. And so what I discovered during my reporting is that at multiple public health labs, the CT cutoff is actually set at something like 37 or even 40. And so all of the people who have CT values of between 33 and 40 are people who probably were infected weeks and weeks ago and are no longer infectious and really don't need to be isolating. So the key there is, you know, when you asked me the question, you said kind of false positive or something like that. These aren't really false positives in the sense that they are still people who were infected. Those cases still count towards the case count in the United States. The point, though, is that we are testing these people way too late. We are getting to them well after they have stopped being contagious, well after they have probably infected others, and at a point at which it's not useful anymore for them to isolate.
That is a really, really important clarification, and that I think that'll help it make a lot more sense for some people who may have misunderstood what that meant. So Seth, I'm actually going to be asking you some questions today because I think it's going to be interesting to get the physician perspective on what Apoorva had reported on with regard to the CDC. So the statement that they put out on testing, what do you think a statement of this nature might have looked like had it actually come from scientific and medical experts at the CDC?
Yeah, well, so there's kind of two issues here. One is the actual kind of overall content, the thrust of what the policy decisions are, like who should be tested, do asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people need to be tested after exposures, that sort of thing. And that's where we're most concerned of where the political shenanigans happened, kind of on top of what the scientists at CDC really thought was the correct answers there. And that was really, politics over policy, basically, is the real question. The kind of secondary thing that happened is that there were a lot of kind of, misuse of terms or kind of unscientific use of terms, like mixing up COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2, the disease and the virus, in ways that basically almost kind of gave away that there was non-scientific input here. In some ways, it was almost kind of paradoxically helpful to kind of see the fingerprints of the non-scientists on it. Just you see that sort of thing, and it's kind of like, wait a minute, this just doesn't sit right. Is something wrong here? This may not have been written or gone through the proper channels. And I think that's something we've seen before with this administration, that by not crossing the T's and dotting the I's, it's led to problems with it in the Supreme Court and things like that are well beyond our scope today. But in some ways, it was, I think, paradoxically helpful to kind of reinforce that the concerns about where, who is writing the guidelines and what they're based on, it kind of corroborates the concerns that Apoorva found.
Right. And what do you think would be so they actually fixed this. I think they changed it on the 18th on Friday. But if they would have left it the way it was, what would have been the sort of public health implications of that advice?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the big challenges we have with this pandemic are that so many people, either don't show symptoms or show symptoms well after they've realized that they were infecting a lot of other people. So figuring out who has asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic infection is really important. And if anything, we're way behind the ball in testing. We've talked about this for months. We're doing far too few tests, not too many tests. We're not doing contact tracing. We're not doing test and trace the way we ideally would be, where we're able to say, oh, I came in contact with people who are sick. Do I have, am I infected? Am I at risk for getting other people infected before I show symptoms? If we, start, foregoing testing on people who are potentially infectious, we're never going to get this thing under control.
Right. And I think another really disheartening thing that we didn't talk about from the New York Times, or from Apoorva's article in the New York Times, was that it sounded like with regard to this CDC testing guidance, all of the media inquiries with regard to that were directed to the HHS and the White House. And the HHS sent a talking points document through the CDC. And like I said, luckily the guidelines were updated on the 18th to reflect the need for testing some pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic people. But sort of moving forward, what do you think we as physicians and researchers should do with information that put forward by the CDC? How can we review it and know whether it's coming from scientists or politicians? And where are we going for reliable information at this point?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's a really tough question. One of the very many sad things about this pandemic is how much trust we're eroding, and our big astute institutions that have been doing historically done a really good job and have really put science ahead of politics, and it's really tough to know what to do with that going forward. Again, we were lucky this time that they didn't do a great job, and there were kind of the unscientific fingerprints all over it. Right now we've got a ton of journals that are holding rigorous standards. We've got a lot of people out there being in public talking about things and trying to clarify things. But I mean, like it's like the MMWR that you were talking about a minute ago. I'm a pretty big nerd when it comes to really medicine in general, medical journals, publishing, stuff like that. And MMWR is stuff that's like I consider like way too nerdy for me most of the time. And the fact that even that's getting politicized just show how far it's come. And it's the same problem we're going to see with vaccines. We're now there's now going to be so many concerns about whether a vaccine was rushed or should be approved or shouldn't be approved, that it's going to kind of make some of the historic tinfoil hat concerns about vaccines actually true. We're kind of squaring that circle in a terrible way.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see some reporting from Apoorva on vaccines soon. So thank you, Apoorva, for joining us again. And Seth, thank you for joining us as a guest today. Some really important topics we covered today. Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Hello, Impactful Chats fans. This is Mark Shapiro here. I'm a hospitalist and the host of Explore the Space podcast. I am grateful to Malin for sharing her mic with me for a moment to talk about the Morning Report initiative with Vote Health 2020. Through my years in medical school, residency, and as an attending, I could count the number of conversations that I have had about voting with fellow medical students and residents and physician colleagues on one hand. Somehow it's become normal for us to not help mobilize and energize one another around voting. And this has cost us dearly. Physicians vote at a rate that is 9% less than the general public, 22% less than attorneys. This November 3rd, there is a presidential election. But remember, your ballot will be filled with so much more. State elections, local elections, bond measures. You may be electing your local sheriff or deciding on a measure around carbon offsets in your county. The issues and initiatives that impact our communities and the lives of those that we care for are not hearing our voice and feeling our impact. It's time that we change that. The process is simple. Check your eligibility to register and get registered to vote. Then decide if you'd like to vote absentee or mail-in. They mean the same thing. And check the deadlines for your state. If you're planning to vote in person, make a voting plan. This is critical for us in medicine. Check your work schedule, talk to your teammates, discuss how you'll cover for one another to ensure everyone can get to the polling place on election day. Then cast your ballot. I've chosen to vote absentee this election because I'm working on election day. Take a look at this slide. It's got everything you need to move through these steps in one place, and it takes just a few minutes. We want to bring this message far and wide. The Morning Report initiative with Vote Health 2020 is here to help do just that. If you'd like to have me or another physician on our Vote Health 2020 team join any meeting you've got virtually, we'll be there. Morning Report, grand rounds, team huddles, you're having a coffee with some pals, anything. Just email info@votehealth2020.com to schedule. We'll set up a free, less than 5-minute presentation that is nonpartisan and has everything your audience needs to get activated. You can also check out www.votehealth2020.com. No excuses this election and going forward, my friends. Thank you all so much for what you do, and thank you, Malin, for letting me come on and talk about this.